Marianne, are you
Yeah,
connected?
I'm here.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just welcome everyone to our second interview for the interview series created by Marsy's Law, Why We Do What We Do. Marsy's Law was named after Marsy Nicholas, who in 1983 was killed and after having been stalked by her ex-boyfriend in California. And right after that happened, Marsy's brother, Dr. Henry Nicholas, and Marsy's mom went to visit Marsy's grave and then went to a supermarket where they were confronted by Marsy's accused murderer. And Dr. Nicholas and Dr. Nicholas's mom had no idea that he had been released on bail. From that point on, after having not been notified that his sister's accused murderer was out on bail, Dr. Nicholas made it his lifelong mission to create meaningful and enforceable constitutional rights for victims all across the country. Marsy's Law was formed in 2009 by Dr. Nicholas, and he has been providing his expertise and resources to Marsy's Law ever since then, every day, all around the country. Now, in the criminal justice system, people often point to statistics. And our work here at Marsy's Law reminds us that behind every statistic, there's a story that needs to be told, and a person and a family that needs to be heard. And like Dr. Nicholas, there are people who are called to this life-changing work that often are inspired and motivated by their own personal stories. We're fortunate to have one of those people with us today, Marianne Dunavant, who was called to this life-changing work in a very personal and painful way back in 2007, on October 26th of 2007. Marianne is now the director of victim outreach for Marsy's Law in Tennessee. Marianne, welcome, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Marianne, I want to just start by bringing you back to 2006 when you met a very special young man named Chris Karras. Can you tell us about Chris?
I can. I remember the day that I met him. He was the nicest, kindest soul. He had a beautiful smile and beautiful blue eyes. And the more we talked, the more I realized that Chris was my dreamer. He was this dreamer who he was filled with so many thoughts and so many things that he wanted to do and things he wanted to become. And I loved it about him because while it was a lot of hard work to get there, he was just a simple, appreciated the small things. And from the first day that I met him, I knew that he was special.
Now, you talk about one specific day as being a day that started out as the best day of your life, and it turned out to be the worst day of your life. And specifically, it was October 26th of 2007. You, at that point, had fallen in love with Chris Karras, and you'd moved in together. And the morning of October 26, 2007 started in a very special way. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, so Chris and we met not long after we met. We had just decided to merge our lives together because we knew that our ultimate goal was to get married, to start a family, and just to work towards his dream of being a professional fisherman, which he loved. And while we had had many of those talks, and we had visited his family so that they could get to know me initially, before we told everybody about that, I remember that day he woke up, and I would always go to work during the day. He worked at night because he wanted to be able to have time to fish during the day. But I remember him waking up saying, I'm ready to get married. I want to get married. And I'm ready to be married to you. And I just remember being so happy to finally hear him say that, because it was what I wanted. We wanted to start a family together. And so it was really nice to hear him say, I'm ready. And so we started talking about rings and what that was going to look like. And we started to look online just to figure out what style of ring I wanted and what we could afford. And as I went to work that day, we continued to look at rings, and I sent him a picture of a ring that I loved. And that ring was beautiful because it was this ring diamond in the middle, and it had two stones on each side, and it just reminded me of his eyes. I just remember that ring symbolized to me just him looking back at me. And so I sent it to him, and he said, that's the one. And so we got that ring, and I was very proud to start my day being able to tell everybody that. And at work, I sat at work showing my girlfriends, what about this one? What about that one? And so it was just a fun day. And so, yeah, that was the start of the day.
And you settled on a ring and you ordered that one online, and you went to work at the Tennessee State Legislature that day, and Chris went to work that night at a pizza place in Nashville called Bellacino's. And that night, and typically he would be done, the restaurant would close at around 10 o'clock, and you would get a call or a text from him saying, oh, we're just closing up, we're cashing out the drawers, and should be home pretty soon. But something happened that night, and it was about 10:20, and you hadn't heard from him, and things seemed to be a little bit different. And what was going on in your mind at that point?
So just growing up and having a story to tell, just how I was raised and what I had lived with. One of the things that I loved most about Chris was his constant communication. So he made me feel safe. He made me feel like he wanted me to know where he was, because I'd always feared just the unknown. And so much, and I didn't ask that of him, but he gave it to me. And I think that's what I appreciated. But he would tell me if he stopped to pump gas, hey, I stopped to get gas, I'm going to be 5 minutes longer. But I loved that about him. It was constantly just updating me. And so, yeah, typically he wouldn't get home till 10:30 or 11. And so that wasn't uncommon. And at 10, I'd always get my text with my notification of, we're closing the store, 2 customers left. 10:15, they're still here. I'm going to be a while. So I knew what that time was like. And I had gone to sleep, and I sat straight up in the bed at 10:20. And I immediately had this panic feel, and I grabbed my phone to look for that notification, and it wasn't there. And it was different. And so I called him, and he didn't answer. That felt different. I called his work. He didn't answer. And I immediately started crying. It was the weirdest thing. Something in me felt that something wasn't right. And I started to put clothes on so that I could quickly start driving to his work, because I just knew that it wasn't our normal routine.
And you got in the car and drove directly to Bellacino's. And as you got closer and got over the hill towards the restaurant, what was it that you saw?
So I made a turn on White Bridge Road, and I'll never forget, as I made that turn, I literally prayed to God in that moment, please do not let his car be there, hoping that he had just left his phone behind and was heading home, and we had crossed paths. But as I got to the top of the hill, I started to see emergency vehicle light, and that scared me. And I got over the hill and realized quickly that something very wrong had happened. And I pulled up. I didn't even turn my car off. I threw the door open and went running towards the door, and a cop stopped me and said, ma'am, you've got to stay out. And I said, my fiancé is in there. And he said, what's his name? And I said, it's Chris Karras. He said, I think he's okay. Let me check on him. And I stood there waiting with a little bit of hope, because he told me he thought he was okay. But then I noticed someone that had worked at the store walking towards me, and I could just tell by the look on his face. And so I said, please tell me that Chris is okay. And he just shook his head no. And it was in that moment that I broke down, and I just had to learn that the person I loved more than anything was gone. And still till this day, I get emotional saying that.
And at some point you went and saw the police chaplain, and you asked him if you could go and see Chris.
So he actually came to me as I stood there in panic and just devastated. And it was obvious. I guess they sent him to me. And so that this man come walking to me, and he introduced himself as the chaplain. And I just said, I need to see him. I need to be with him. And he just said, he goes, baby girl, you don't want to see him. And so, and then he walked away. Like he told me that they were handling the crime scene and that they were doing the best that they could, but then he walked away. And in that moment, I stood there in a parking lot, just devastated and lost and confused. And I had no one there in that moment. And no one was talking to me to help me understand. And was very confusing. And I called Chris's parents. They were my first phone call because I didn't know what else to do other than call his mom. And delivering that news over the phone in such a traumatic way. His father answered the phone and said, "Marianne, I can't understand you. Let me give the phone to Jeannie." And when he passed the phone on, delivering that news in such a shock myself was the second hardest thing that I think I've ever done.
And at some point, did you find out what had happened inside that restaurant?
You know, in that moment, I didn't know and I didn't understand. I knew that he had been shot and I knew that he was gone, but I was being told that I needed to go home. They wanted to bring them out and they didn't want me to see that and understand that. But I left that night so confused of how do I just leave him? How do I just walk away? And how do I not comfort him and be there for him in his final moments, dead or alive? I wanted to hug him and I didn't get to. And so I had to get in my car and I had to drive home. And I literally went home and his pajamas were on the floor where he had taken them off. And I put on his pajamas and I crawled into the bed and I don't know, I couldn't comprehend what had just happened.
And your memory of that night, as far as your instructions were your best memory is that you were told to go home.
That was my only instruction. And I know they had work to do and I appreciate that. And I love our law enforcement for what they do all day, every day. But there needs to be I felt like in that moment I needed, because I couldn't process a thought. So I did need someone to help me in that moment to understand. And oh, by the way, it wasn't the safest thing for me to get in a car and drive myself home, as traumatized as I was. And so I do wish that there would be something there on the scene for victims experiencing that trauma.
And you when you retell this story so many times, you have talked about the fact that you said that Chris broke a promise to you. What do you mean when you say that?
So I struggled through life with a beautiful mother who never experienced a real good, true love. And she was married 4 times and divorced 4 times. And ultimately her life ended alone. And she just put so much into men that I just didn't trust always that a man was going to stay, because I was used to seeing them come and go and come and go. And I really thought that I just assumed that Chris would be that person too for a while. And he finally said, "Marianne, we don't put up walls to keep people out. We put up walls to see who cares enough to knock them down." And he said, "When are you going to learn that I'm not going anywhere?" And those words stuck with me until this very day. I'll never forget him saying them, because it made me believe that he saw that I was putting up walls to keep him out in fear that he would leave me. And he reassured me and he promised me. And then his actions proved it to me by telling me he wanted to spend his life with me, by making plans and getting and us living together and buying things together. It proved it to me. And so I believe that someone on October the 26th came into our life and forced him to break that promise. I know he didn't want to, but they forced him to do that. And as a result, I was left feeling alone and abandoned all over again at the age of 35.
And you later learned that inside that restaurant that someone had gone to rob the store, and what had happened to Chris.
So, and I'm sad to, well, I'm glad there was a video, but I'm sad to say that I watched part of it, because they came in the store when the store was closing and they placed an order, and then the employee inside locked the door to prevent anyone else from coming in. They finished with the customers that they had. And then I quickly you can see the guy go around through the side door to where the employees are. And it was in that moment that I saw Chris drop to his knees and put his hands up, and I could see him pleading for his life. And that's a thought I'll never get rid of. Then Chris took him into the office and gave him everything. And he had Chris lay face down, and he had everybody else laying face down out front. And the guy went to the back door. He put his hand on the door, and for whatever reason, he stopped and he turned around and he came back. And as Chris and Josh Cole, who was also killed, laid face down, he went over to them and shot them both in the back of the head. He shot Chris first. And in that video, you see Josh trying to crawl to get to Chris to help him. And then he came over and shot Josh, who was 18 years old, in the back of the head as well. And then he ran out the door, dropping a lot of the money. So it was very senseless and for a few $100s.
And Josh was his coworker.
Josh was his coworker.
And after that, you also experienced, so many times people, I'm a former prosecutor myself, a homicide prosecutor from Boston, thus the difference in accents between your Tennessee accent and my Boston accent. And so many times people ask, how do you get out of bed in the morning after something like that happens to a loved one? And you said it took you about 3 months to literally get out of bed, with the exception of Chris's funeral. Is that right?
That is a very true story. I went to bed that night, and I have such amazing friends and family. So my friends just surrounded me. I can remember I struggled. I wouldn't get out of the bed. I wouldn't eat. I wouldn't do anything. I needed medication to help me sleep, because sleeping was the only time I didn't feel pain. But they made a schedule and took shifts and took care of me. And I became very unhealthy and very sad, and I was very grief stricken, and it was hard. And I laid in that bed for 3 months solid.
And that unspeakable, really paralyzing pain that you experienced, you now talk, when you talk about the work that you do on behalf of victims, is that you have turned that pain into a purpose. And after a few months, you got back on your feet, literally and figuratively, and you went back to work. But one of the things that you did, you were telling me, I remember, was you made a call that a lot of people would be surprised about. You made a call to the commissioner of the Department of Corrections, because you wanted to speak to offenders to see how people could actually inflict pain like that on victims and on their family members and their loved ones. What happened with that phone call, and what did you do?
So interestingly enough, I had been at the legislature for a few years, and I can remember going home to Chris saying, I just don't feel like I'm making a difference. And I'm a girl who likes to make a difference. And he said, well, then do something different. And I'll tell you, when Chris died, I worked at the legislature, and I had access to information that when I went back finally, many victims don't have or are not aware of. And so, I was able to go back and pick up the phone and make a phone call and say, okay, I need to understand. I want to go into the prison. I want to tour it. I want to see it. And I want to speak to someone who's committed murder, because I have questions. And they made it very clear that I wasn't allowed to speak to Chris's murder or anything to do with his case. And I said, that wasn't my intent, but I did want to just understand what I was dealing with so that I could move forward and process it. And so that was a phone call I made, and I went toward the prison. And in that first time, I can remember going in there strong as ever, I thought, and then feeling very vulnerable once I got inside. But I had access to talk to the inmates.
And you had an experience where you now say, and one of the things that you say often is people don't know what it's like to be a victim until you are a victim. And that's why you do the work you do, to try to create a culture that is friendly to victims and supportive of victims. And you relay a story, and I would love you to share it with us, about an offender, a murderer that you met, that really underscores what you talk about. No one knows what it's like to be a victim unless you are a victim.
So we watch it on TV and we feel bad for somebody. No, that has to be horrible. And you empathize, but until you live it, you don't know. And the best example, and I have this on video. I went in with the prisons with a man named Rudy Kalis, who worked for a news station at the time, and we created a video called Choices and Consequences. I interviewed a man who had committed murder at 18 years old. He robbed a fast food restaurant, shot and killed someone, and he'd been in prison for a while. And he told me that his family would come and visit him. His mother, said she forgave him, and all he could ever think about was himself. I'm sitting in prison for the rest of my life. I'm not going to get out, and my mom. And so he said all he thought about was himself. While he was in prison, he got a phone call that his sister had been murdered, and he was allowed to go to that funeral shackled and chained. He said when he walked in, he could hear his mother screaming, and she was draped over the casket saying, "How could someone do something like this? How could someone kill my baby?" So the very mother that was loving her child who did something like that is now saying, how could someone do something like that? And he said it wasn't until that very moment that he realized he wasn't the victim. He was the offender, and that's the pain that he caused someone else. And that was the most powerful, powerful moment that I've ever experienced inside the prisons.
And another experience that you had inside the prisons was encountering a group called You Have the Power, who would come and speak to inmates as well. Tell us a little bit about your experience with You Have the Power.
So I was introduced to Verna Wyatt and Valerie Craig, who worked with You Have the Power at the time. And I learned that they did classes to help offenders learn and understand how their actions affect others. And she said to me, at some point when you're ready, we would love to have you come back and share your story. And I said, I'm ready. And it was only like 6 months after Chris had died. And she said, well, it's very soon. Are you sure? And I said, yes, I am. And so I found my therapy in prison because I got to release all of that pain to the very people who needed to hear it the most. And I stood there and I would always say, I walked in there and they would kind of look at me like I didn't know them. You don't understand where we come from. So I didn't want them to not listen. So I quickly said, I'm going to tell you about my childhood and how I grew up and how I was raised so that you'll understand that I understand you and relate with you more than you would ever imagine. And as I would share my story, I could see that they would start to bring their walls down a bit. They would start to listen to me more. Many would cry with me and raise their hands. And I had to help them realize that you all are sitting in here feeling sorry for yourselves when your childhood isn't what put you here. It's how you chose to respond to it that put you here. And that part was a choice because I chose to be different than the environment I was raised in. And so I really want to help offenders with rehabilitation while we have them so that when they get out, they don't reoffend. But I also want them to understand the consequences to their actions. And it doesn't stop with them. It's so much broader. I mean, someone ruined his life and sits in jail for killing Chris, but guess what? Chris's life is gone. My life, as I knew it, was gone with them and destroyed, and all of the family and friends around us. It's a trickling effect.
So you continued to give Chris a voice, and through Chris, you did your work to become a force for good, not just for victims, but also for offenders, to show them that. I think you said that you were talking to me about how victims can choose to become anything they want. Victims can become offenders, but victims can also become survivors, like you have, and also healers, which you have as well. And on top of your work at Marsy's Law, you also began to advocate for victims in your work in the state legislature and various nonprofits and domestic violence shelters. You started a domestic violence shelter, the first domestic violence shelter actually in your own county. And you also worked on a few pieces of legislation, one for victim notification, to make sure that victims' information was not on public domains. Also work with exclusionary rules and evidence to work on behalf of victims. And then also there was a bill called the Victim Life Photo Bill that
Yes.
you were a real champion of in the state of Tennessee and ultimately helped get passed. I see you have a photo there with you. Can you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about that and in the Victim Life Photo Bill?
So when Chris died, I realized if I do nothing, he dies for nothing. And I refused to let that happen. And I also thought, now I know I work here. I work here because I have access to do something more than most. And so I did not take that for granted. And I hit the ground running and I started listening to all of those issues and how we can make it better. And yes, ending with the Victim Life Photo Bill to where at one time you weren't, prosecutors were not allowed to show a photo of a person who had been murdered. And the argument was, well, we don't want the juries to feel sorry for them. And I understand that you want it to be, when we say a victim life photo, I can't show a 3-year-old photo when he died at 33. So the judge has discretion on approving that picture, but we thought it was only fair that, again, that victims are not just a piece of evidence. The picture of him laying down with his head blown off, to me, can you see me? So there we go. To me, would have been I would, as a juror, I'd feel more sorry for that than to see a picture like this. But I believe that Chris deserved to be seen and known as the human being he is, so that he's not just a piece of evidence. He's a person. And when we talk about Chris, I think it's important that the jurors know who Chris is. Now, that bill passed after Chris died, but I do believe that because Chris died, a lot of good things are happening, and I'm his voice.
And you continue to be in your work at Marsy's Law as a director of outreach for victims in Tennessee. And personally, with respect to Marsy's Law, how it could have helped you back in 2007, as the fiancée to Chris and someone who lived with him at the time, because of the way the victim was defined in Tennessee law. You had no rights to be notified of any of the court dates. Is that correct?
That is correct. Chris and I were not married. Therefore, his family received all of the notification, and we don't want to change that in any way, shape, or form. They should have that information. But Chris's family lived out of town, California and Michigan, and they didn't have easy access to every single court date. And believe me, there's a lot that lead up to the final court date. And so I was present for every single one, but not because I was handed the information, because technically I wasn't the victim. So someone else had control over that information. And I do believe that it's important that we recognize and include, again, at the judge's discretion, if someone lives with the person who is shot and killed, or whatever happens to them, I believe that person who loved them and lived life with them and paid bills with them and had a future plan with them, I think it's only fair that they should have legal access to that information as well.
And that is one of the things that would change with the passage of Marsy's Law. It would include the people who live with the victim to have all of the enforceable constitutional rights with respect to a whole series of rights, including notification, so that you wouldn't have had to rely on Josh's family, as the case was with Chris's case. And the constitutional rights that will come with Marsy's Law also come only after a long process in Tennessee. The bill right now will have to go through 2 consecutive legislative cycles, and then ultimately it will be voted on in 2022 by the people of Tennessee in order to pass as a constitutional amendment. And that's what you're working on right now. Is that right?
That's right. And, we've had a lot going on this year in Tennessee with, sadly, we've had tornadoes and we've had floods and we've had the COVID-19 happening. And so to have it heard this year and next and make that 22 ballot. Obviously, that's what we want. But yes, that's our goal. But if for whatever reason that we're not able to do that due to unforeseen circumstances, then certainly 2026 would we hope would be the latest, because victims really deserved it yesterday.
Yeah, well,
And we'll fight till we get it.
we're blessed to have you as our ally, as our advocate, as our champion. And you have, we have to wrap up right now, but you have something special that you wear to remind you why this is important. Could you just tell us quickly what you have on that necklace?
You know, I do. Chris always referred to me as Sunshine. That's what he called me. And he would always sing the song, "You Are My Sunshine." And so I wear my engagement ring that I got after that I received in, after he had already died, but turned it into a necklace. It's shaped now like a sunshine, and I love it. I wear it every day. It's close to my heart. And everything I do is to honor him and other victims, so that we know that they didn't die for anything. They gave their life, and because of it, we're going to do everything in our power to save others.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for giving Chris a voice and for giving victims and their families voices all around Tennessee and all around the country. And you can visit us at marsyslaw.us to learn more about our nationwide effort to ensure the constitutional rights that victims deserve and that justice demands. Thank you so much, Marianne, and we look forward to seeing everyone in the next Why We Do What We Do 2 weeks from today. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.